Today we're trimming up spare ribs for a competition. Alright, so today here's a quick video on how to trim spare ribs into St. Louis and competition cut. Today I'm using a rack of spare ribs from Smithfield, and if you're unfamiliar with where spares come from, here in this crude illustration you can see where this rack would fit on a hog. The straight edge on the top is where they are cut from the baby backs or loin backs, and the rest of the pig is made up of hams, shoulders, picnic, belly, and so forth. Now what we're going to do with this rack of ribs is take that long straight edge where the spares were cut from the babies and use that as a guide to make a parallel cut below it to get what's called a St. Louis cut. From there we're going to trim that down into a slimmed up version using competition where, believe it or not, only 3 or 4 ribs from this general area will actually be used for judging. Now when it comes to trimming spares, the first thing I like to do is remove the skirt or flap meat along the back of the ribs. From my understanding, this is where the diaphragm attaches to the rib cage. Once that's trimmed off, the next step is to remove the membrane. Now there are 2 membranes on a rack of ribs, so be gentle to only remove the top one. Use a small butter knife to gently work it under the outer membrane along a bone, usually at one edge. And once you have a decent section worked loose, use a paper towel to pull it free from the rack like a piece of masking tape. If it doesn't come off all in one clean pull, just work at it and remove what you can. Just be careful not to remove that second membrane, the lower membrane, because if you do, the bones will be completely exposed and your rack will fall apart when you cook it. Now most racks of spares have somewhere around 11 to 13 bones. The 4th bone down from the front end of the rack, which will be closest to where the shoulder is of the hog, should be the longest bone in the rack. The top of that bone is going to be the guide for how wide this rack will be cut for St. Louis style ribs. So using the long straight edge as a guide where the spares were separated from the baby backs, score a line that's parallel to the long edge down the rack of ribs. Once you have a straight line that you're happy with, cut along that line with a good knife and separate the riblets from the ribs. You shouldn't really be cutting through bone, just cartilage, though you can see here I cut a little bit through the 4th rib, maybe the 3rd as well, but it's not a big deal. It's still going to look pretty. Now, you don't have to throw those riblets away. You can season them and cook them up just like you would a rack of ribs on the smoker, and you can throw them in a pot of beans or whatever. Anyways, there you have it, the St. Louis cut. Now to make these competition ready, a little more trimming is usually done. The first bone on this rack, it really lacks enough meat to cook, so I just trim it right down at the bone there, make a nice clean cut there. And then, in my experience, the end of the rack, the aft end, where the grind is, usually just a bit too much cartilage, so usually about 2 bones back, I'll usually trim that up, about make a 90-degree cut there, clean it up real nice so the rack just looks real pretty. And to make these a bit more competition ready, a little more trimming is done, taking a little excess fat off the top, and look for any large pockets of fat on the back in the valley of the ribs. You don't want a judge to bite in that and get a mouthful of unrendered fat. Now I'm not saying these are going to get you a 180 score, but that's it, essentially. A trimmed up St. Louis cut ready for a KCBS comp. All that's left is seasoning, smoke, and a whole lot of love. Thanks for watching, y'all.